The history of the Japanese internment camps. Japanese Americans' experiences in the internment camps resulted in economic, social, and psychological trauma. President Franklin D. Roosevelt gave his famous speech to Congress in which he named Pearl Harbor a day that will live in infamy. He signed Executive Order 9066, which ordered the forced removal of all persons deemed a threat to national security from the West Coast to internment camps, otherwise known as relocation centers. There were 10 internment camps that were scattered across the West Coast. These are the camp locations on a bigger scale map. The photos that surround them are what life looked like inside the internment camps. All camps were surrounded by a barbed wire fence. There were a lot of factors contributing to the incarceration of Japanese Americans. The first was racism. In 1905, anti-Japanese sentiment rose after a rise in Japanese immigration. There was a league in California that attempted to segregate Japanese children in schools. There were attacks on people, businesses, and homes. California introduced the Alien Land Law in 1913, which barred Asian immigrants from owning land, and it became stronger in 1920 when California reintroduced it and barred the leasing of land and land ownership by American-born children of Asian immigrant parents. Another factor was economics. Japanese Americans became very successful farmers on the West Coast, so a lot of people felt a rise in economic competition. There was also wartime hysteria. In the aftermath of Pearl Harbor, all Japanese Americans were seen as threats since Japan bombed Pearl Harbor. The United States Justice Department arrested 3,000 individuals who were considered quote-unquote dangerous aliens, half of whom were of Japanese descent. There was no evidence of espionage or causes for arrest. A key player in the incarceration of Japanese Americans was Lieutenant General John DeWitt. He was a commander of the Western Defense Command and the U.S. Fourth Army. He described the removal of Japanese Americans as a military necessity. It was his recommendation that all Japanese, whether they be native-born or were born in Japan, living on the West Coast be removed from their homes. He has been quoted to say, "The Japanese race is an enemy race." A lot of injustices occurred in these camps. When Japanese Americans were forced into internment camps, they were not given their right to due process protected by the Fifth Amendment. The Japanese were affected economically. Japanese camp residents lost about $400 million in property due to the incarceration. Adjusted to 2020, Japanese are predicted to have lost $4.6 billion in property. In 1988, Ronald Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, which gave all living Japanese Americans who endured the camps $20,000 in restitution and a formal apology. The Japanese were also affected socially. Anti-Japanese sentiment heightened during World War II. Wartime propaganda dehumanized Japanese people and led to more Japanese hate and prejudice in the United States. Propaganda against the Japanese depicted them as unintelligent, murderers, racist stereotypes, and normalized Japanese slurs. In popular magazines, Japanese Americans were presented as the enemy and isolated from the Asian community. The Japanese were also affected psychologically during their time in the camp. They felt dehumanized and felt the repercussions of wartime propaganda that swayed the United States to treat them as such. Japanese Americans were deprived of their civil rights during their time in the camps, and many of those who knew their civil rights and knew they were being violated could not understand why or how the government was doing this. This caused some to take their own lives in the camps. Many children of Japanese immigrants spent their childhoods and early 20s in the internment camps, which resulted in stunted American identity. The following video is a survivor of the Topaz internment camp.
Well, my mother had a very hard time in Topaz, and the stress of incarceration and being called the enemy, and why was the government doing to this? She was a college person, so she knew her rights. It just affected her to the point where she couldn't carry on, and she never did recover from that. My mother was a real casualty of Topaz, and I'm sure there were many others too.
The ages of those who were murdered ranged from those who were 17 to 65. The history of the Japanese internment camps is important because it is important that we remember the history of Japanese Americans in America. It is also important to remember what Richard Reeves mentions in his book, that no Japanese American or person of Japanese ancestry living in the United States was found guilty of any serious act of espionage or sabotage during World War II. Thank you.